of 2014, the Sheriff's Department in a quaint, secluded Oregon town launched an investigation on a sprawling, enigmatic 20-acre farm nestled deep within a dense forest. A local man had mysteriously disappeared, and this remote farm was one of the last known locations he had visited. Shortly after the search began, a deputy, carefully patrolling the barn's perimeter, spotted something bizarre lying on the ground. At first it was an unidentifiable shape, puzzling and out of place, but as he approached, its nature became unmistakably clear. This chilling discovery would not only dominate national headlines, but would also unravel a far darker mystery simmering beneath the surface of that seemingly quiet town. By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends. She had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm. You know, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then, one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in. There was no barn for her animals or tools. There was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely. And she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labour. So when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realised that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so, not long after the farm was complete, Susan realised that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help-wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle or struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle bouncing around from place to place, so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard, and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And those workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help, wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now, remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. In this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car popped 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman, and before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him. And since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him. And so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm, and initially Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard. He kept to himself. He was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much, and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did, and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behaviour had become very disruptive on her farm. And the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behaviour and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack. He handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behaviour and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look after your dog." And then Robert nodded as thank you. He turned around and he walked away from her. And then, a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled off in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him. And then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago. And since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place. But the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a travelling handyman. That was how he made his living. And so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone. He had no permanent address. He had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially murdered someone, and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card? EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable." A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now, or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera and, unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so, obviously, this was very suspicious, and right away, the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, "You know what's going on?" they told her, "Hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance." And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, "Hold on, just turn around. Let's go back inside. I need to talk to you privately." And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, "Okay." And she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away, the sheriff says to Susan, "Okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you." And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here, and she says to the sheriff, "No, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after, and since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card. But Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. And so, after several minutes, the sheriff realised that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and, without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down, looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, "Has anyone died on your property?" The story that Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific. It would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away. After that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs, who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up, and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen, and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground, as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on. And so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realised they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs, and she begins pulling them aside, and then, right in the middle on the ground, is Robert. He was laying on his back, and his insides had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him. And the most shocking thing is, Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, "You know, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyways." And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn, because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask, and so he just said, "Well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe we could have saved him, or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone?" Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream, because she sold her pig's meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive, and so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again she continued to fidget and yawn, and so finally the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, "Hey, we're going to search your farm, and if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble, because we're going to find it." At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back and she began drawing something, and after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm, and after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators, and she said, "If you go to that X, you'll find Stephen." And the investigators are like, "Who's Stephen?" "We're talking about Robert." "What are you talking about?" Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delagino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with. He was quiet. He worked hard. But at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in a barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next. But at some point during this fight, a gun went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. These stunned investigators again asked Susan, "Okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident?" And Susan would say again that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched as Susan's stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delagino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so, as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan, and they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen, and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. On the evening of July the 25th, 2008, a 59-year-old man named Brian Thomas walked hand in hand with his wife Christine out of the restaurant where they had just had dinner. The couple was in this little village right on the coast of Wales, and where they were now walking outside of this restaurant was right along the water. And so, as they did that, Brian found himself looking out over the sea, and he saw the reflection of the moon on the waves, and it was so beautiful. And then he turned to his wife, and she was so stunning. And so Brian finally just stopped and kinda just took in all this incredible beauty right in front of him, and he began smiling ear to ear, which was a big departure from how Brian had been feeling over the past few months, because Christine had recently had a big scare. She'd been told she might have cancer, and so she went in for all this testing, and then she and Brian had to wait for it to come back, and the wait was absolute torture. I mean, basically, Brian and Christine were prepping themselves to find out Christine really did have cancer, but when the results did come back, it would turn out Christine did not have cancer, and so Christine was obviously hugely relieved, but it was actually Brian who was more relieved. It was like he suddenly saw he could lose his wife of 40 years, who he had raised a family with. I mean, this was like the most important person in Brian's life, but it was like he didn't fully appreciate that until he realised he could lose this really important person. And so now that Christine had a clean bill of health, Brian was committed to showering her with love and affection and taking her to restaurants and on vacations. And in fact, the reason they were actually in this village in Wales is because they were on one of Brian's many vacations for Christine. He had gone out and bought this little camper van, and they had driven it up to this part of Wales. And then, after this vacation ended, Brian's plan was to use this camper to travel with his wife all over Great Britain, and so the couple had a really busy schedule coming up. But for right now, Brian was focused on just staying in the moment and enjoying this newfound happiness he was feeling, and so he and his wife would continue to just kinda walk along the water for a bit. And then finally, when they felt tired, they headed back to their camper. They went inside, they got in their bed, and they fell asleep. A little before 4 a.m, Brian suddenly woke up inside of this camper, and so he sits upright and he looks around. You know, it's totally dark inside of there. He can't see anything. He doesn't really know why he just woke up, and he's trying to get his bearings. And then, as his eyes kind of begin to focus, he realises there is a person standing inside of their camper right near the door. Basically 10-15 feet away from he and his wife is a person, and so Brian just froze and he's staring at this person, hoping this is just a dream or something. But then this person, who appeared to be dressed in all black head to toe, began to move, and they began to move first to the left and then towards the bed. And so Brian is still just frozen, thinking, is this real? Is this really happening? And then this person began climbing on the bed on the side where Christine was. And so Brian, without even thinking, just yelled out, "You bastard!" And he jumped off the bed at this guy and began choking them out. And the whole time, Brian is screaming at this person, like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And this person is fighting back so hard, and Brian is just not letting go. It's like instinct is completely taken over, and then this person goes totally still and just dies. And Brian knows he killed them, but they came into his camper. Like, what do you expect? Brian would ultimately be the one who called the police, and just several minutes later, they would show up. And when they got there, they would find Brian standing outside the camper, hyperventilating. And then, when they tried to get more information about what exactly had happened inside the camper, Brian basically couldn't explain it. It was like he was totally in shock. And so, eventually, one of the officers just went inside the camper, and there on the ground they would find a body. But it was not some attacker, it was Brian's wife. It would turn out Brian had a medical condition called somnambulism, which we know as sleepwalking. And at home, he would sleep in a different bed than his wife because he sleepwalked so much. But since they were on vacation in their camper, they had to sleep together because there was only one bed on board the camper. And so not long after Brian and Christine had fallen asleep together, Brian began having this really intense nightmare where he believed his wife was being attacked. And so Brian, in this nightmare, had to stop this person from hurting Christine, except because of his sleepwalking, he acted this out in real life. And the attacker that he ultimately killed was ironically his wife. He basically tackled his wife and strangled her to death because he thought he was actually saving her. Brian was absolutely destroyed with grief and with guilt. And the second he realised what he had done, he confessed. He didn't in any way try to protect himself. He said, "I did this, take me in," and Brian would be arrested. However, in November of 2009, the judge who actually heard Brian's official confession, he kind of felt bad for Brian and said, "You know what? I'm dropping all charges against you because it's obvious to me you are a good and decent person. This was a mistake, and you're going to live with grief and guilt for the rest of your life. And that's punishment enough." One morning in January of 2016, a 45-year-old woman named Lauren walked into an office building in West Virginia where she worked as an office manager, and she dropped her purse, her phone, and her cigarettes on her desk. It was a Friday, and so Lauren was in a really good mood because she was pumped about the weekend. The next day, Saturday, she and her husband, Dan, planned to go on this big hike together. They loved hiking, so that was going to be awesome. And then, on Sunday, Lauren planned to stay home all day and cook one big meal because it had become a tradition in their family that on Sundays, Lauren and Dan's kids, they had 3 kids who were all grown up, they would come back home to their parents' house and they would have a big family meal together. And these dinners were definitely the highlight of the week for Lauren and for Dan because both of them were very family-centric. Lauren switched on her computer and then looked at her schedule and saw she had a whole bunch of meetings back to back to back that day. And so immediately she was worried that she would not be able to slip out that day and go for a quick walk, something she'd recently been doing a lot of because her doctor had recently told her that she had a blood circulation disorder that was called peripheral vascular disease. And what that meant was the arteries that carried the blood from her heart down to her legs and her feet were becoming blocked, and so her legs and feet were not getting enough oxygen. So far, her only symptoms were the occasional leg cramp. But if the disease got worse, it could lead to pain and mobility issues, and also heart attack and stroke. Luckily, Lauren's doctor told her that she didn't need medication. She just needed to quit smoking, change her diet, and become more physically active. And Lauren had totally leaned into this and was being much more active and had changed her diet. She hadn't quit smoking yet, but she planned to. And so Lauren really felt like she was on the right track. And so, as Lauren kind of began her day, going through her emails and thinking about when she's going to do this walk, her cell phone rang. When Lauren looked at the phone, she didn't recognise the number, so she decided to let it go to voicemail. And so Lauren forgot about her phone and just figured, whoever this was, they'd call back or whatever, and she's doing her thing. But then she got another phone call, and when she looked, it was the same number calling her back, and this time Lauren did pick up the phone. And when she said hello, on the other end of the line, she heard a police officer say in a very serious voice, "Am I speaking to Dan's wife?" And so right away, Lauren's heart began to race, and she would tell the officer, "Yes." What's going on? And all the officer would tell her is that Dan, unfortunately, was in a very serious car accident, and so you need to come to the scene right away. In an absolute panic, Lauren hung up the phone. She grabbed her thing. She ran out to the car, and she floored her way to the address the police officer gave her. But when she got there, she saw there were so many police cars and ambulances and all these people that she couldn't even see what was going on, let alone park anywhere near where this accident happened. So she wound up parking her car around the corner, and then she got out and just sprinted towards all the police. And then, when she got up to them, she basically began pushing people out of the way, and no one tried to stop her. They could tell, this woman must know the people involved in this crash. And so she pushed past all these people, and finally she can see through the crowd, and she can see her husband's car, and it's absolutely mangled. And there's all these first responders that are in a circle on the pavement, and she can tell there is somebody on the ground they're working on, and it's got to be Dan. And so Lauren just began running towards that group of people, and as she did, they all stood up as if, there was nothing they could do. And on the ground, Lauren saw her husband. There was Dan lying in this huge pool of blood, just motionless on the ground. And so before she even got over to her husband, Lauren already knew what had happened. Dan was dead. And so Lauren let out this primal shriek and just rushed over to her husband and fell to the ground next to him, holding his body and crying hysterically. And all the EMTs and first responders, they knew hysterically. And all the EMTs and first responders, they knew this woman has just lost her husband. And even though she shouldn't be here right now, they just felt like they have to give this moment to her. And so the police and the EMTs and the rest of the first responders, instead of even talking to Lauren or trying to get her to go somewhere else, they just formed a big circle, shoulder to shoulder, around Lauren and Dan, and just allowed Lauren to grieve in private. About 2 hours later, Lauren returned to her home in a daze. Dan's body had already been transported to the morgue, and a police officer had driven Lauren back to her home, where her 3 kids, her son and her 2 daughters, were now waiting for her. And so, when Lauren went inside the house and went into the living room where her kids were, her kids who already knew what had happened, they just immediately swarmed her and hugged her, and they all just cried together. I mean, this was so horrible and so unexpected that nobody knew what to do. Finally, Lauren tried to speak through her sobs, but when she did, she just couldn't get words out. It was like her chest was so tight she couldn't even speak. And then suddenly, Lauren realised this pressure on her chest was very real, and it was getting worse and worse, to the point where it was genuinely hard to take a breath in. And so Lauren actually said to her kids, "I think I'm having a panic attack." And so her daughter ran to the kitchen to get some water. And as she did, Lauren took a seat on the couch to try to calm down. But by the time her daughter came back with the glass of water, Lauren straight up just could not breathe. I mean, she was trying to pull air in, but it wasn't going in. And she was totally panicking. And so she looked at her kids and just mouthed the words, "I can't breathe." At which point the kids understood. Like, this is way beyond just grief and sadness. Like, she's having a physical emergency right now. And so one of Lauren's daughters picked up the phone and called 911. A few minutes later, An ambulance arrived, and they would take Lauren to a local hospital, but as soon as they got there, the doctors and nurses determined that very likely Lauren had had a heart attack. And even though she was basically stable right now, their fear is she was going to have another one. And this particular local hospital just lacked the resources and staff to actually treat Lauren. And so they pretty much immediately transferred Lauren to another hospital called the J.W. Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia, because that hospital had a specialised cardiac care unit for people with very serious heart problems. Dr. Conrad Fallinger was the cardiologist on duty at J.W. Memorial Hospital when Lauren was brought into the intensive care unit, followed closely behind by her 3 adult children. Now, Dr. Fallinger was used to seeing worried families in the hospital, but Lauren's kids looked far more distressed than he was used to seeing. And when he spoke to Lauren's kids about, what's going on with Lauren, he would see why. The doctor would learn that this family has lost their father, their husband, just a few hours earlier. And the mother, Lauren, who's this patient, she laid with her dead husband out on the road in a pool of blood. And now, these poor kids who've just lost their father, they're seeing their mother go to the ICU for what looks like a heart attack. I mean, this was a total worst case scenario where, basically, everything was going wrong for this family. Dr. Fallinger did his best to push his emotions to the side. He didn't want to get wrapped up emotionally in this case, but at the same time, the doctor felt a very deep need to save Lauren. Like, let this family have one good thing happen to them. But Lauren's condition was pretty dire. Just like the doctors at that local hospital where Lauren went first, Dr. Fallinger also suspected Lauren had a heart attack, very likely because of that blood circulation disorder that she had that basically clogged her arteries. When an artery in the heart gets blocked, the blood can't circulate in the heart, and so the heart dies. And preliminary testing on Lauren showed there was already signs of damage to her heart, in the same way that a heart attack would damage a heart. Her heartbeat was also irregular, and it was too fast, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. And then, also when Dr. Fallinger looked at some imaging of Lauren's heart, he could see that the majority of her heart muscle wasn't even moving. Basically, Lauren's heart was working way harder and way faster than it should be to accomplish nothing. And so, very quickly, Dr. Fallinger realised that unless he was able to find the blocked artery in Lauren's heart and clear it, that Lauren would die. And so Dr. Fallinger looked up at Lauren's 3 kids, who were just standing there in silence, waiting for more bad news. And Dr. Fallinger said to them, "Your mum needs to go into surgery right now." Nurses wheeled Lauren out of the ICU and into surgery, where she was immediately put under anaesthesia. Once Lauren was ready, Dr. Fallinger watched on a monitor as another surgeon fed a thin, flexible tube called a catheter into an artery in Lauren's leg, and then fed it up towards her heart. This surgery was called cardiac angioplasty. Basically, that surgeon was going to use that catheter, that tube, and put it into Lauren's heart and then shoot dye through that catheter tube into the blood in Lauren's heart. And then Dr. Fallinger and the other doctors could watch to see where this dye went. If the dye was pumped out of the heart like it should be, they'd see it go in all different directions. But if at some point on the monitor the dye just stopped inside the heart and didn't go anywhere, then that would mean they found a blockage. And so when the surgeon had the catheter in Lauren's heart, he injected the dye, and they all watched on the monitor, and her heart functioned completely fine. There was no blockage in her heart. Now, the doctors weren't entirely convinced yet that there was no blockage, so they pulled that catheter out, and they got a different one, and they went through the exact procedure all over again to see if maybe that catheter was malfunctioning. But, again, that second time, the dye die didn't stop anywhere. Her heart seemed to be functioning totally normally, and so Dr. Falanger and the rest of the doctors and surgeons, they were all totally baffled, because what this meant was whatever was happening to Lauren, or whatever did happen to Lauren, was not a heart attack. But make no mistake, Lauren's heart was still absolutely dying. It was just some other thing killing it. Dr. Fellner went back to the drawing board, but realistically, there just weren't that many other things to consider with regards to what was happening to Lauren. Heavy alcohol use could in theory cause what was happening to Lauren, but Lauren didn't drink. Infection was another option, but Lauren showed no signs of having an infection. Certain chemotherapy drugs have been known to damage the heart, but Lauren wasn't on chemo and certainly would not have accidentally been exposed to chemo drugs without knowing about it. And so, basically, Dr. Farlinger had no clue what was wrong with Lauren, and he didn't even know where to start. And so Dr. Farlinger just sat in his office feeling so bad about the fact that, these kids are almost certainly going to lose their other parent. I mean, it was his duty to save Lauren, and he couldn't do it. And he just felt so bad. He couldn't even imagine how he was going to deliver the news to the kids that, your mom's going to die, and we don't know why. I mean, this was the worst for Dr. Farlinger. He felt like he had failed as a doctor, but just then, Dr. Farlinger has this epiphany. He remembers this weird medical article he had read somewhat recently, and he realised what was going on with Lauren and her family was like the same thing that happened in that article. And because Dr. Farlinger did not have any other ideas of how to handle what was going on with Lauren, he decided he would just try to do what they did in that article. Because if he was wrong, he had nothing to lose. So, Dr. Farlinger got up and he ran to Lauren's hospital room. And when he got in there, he saw Lauren's kids and he called them over to him. And he would tell them that he's going to give their mom some medication that's going to spike her blood pressure and keep it high, but then he needs them to gather around her and just talk to her like she's your mom. Talk lovingly, soothingly, remind her that you're still here and that everything is okay. And the kids, they all agreed to do this. And then Dr. Farlinger, he gave the medicine to Lauren, and then he watched as her 3 kids circled up around the head of the bed, and they're all crying and holding their mum and telling her how much they love her and please come back to us, come back. And as they're doing this, Dr. Farlinger just quietly walked out of the room, hoping this would work. And sure enough, just a week later, Lauren was all better. It would turn out the way in which Lauren lost her husband. Both the suddenness of getting that phone call combined with just the unthinkable horror of seeing your loved one on the road in a pool of blood dead. I mean, that situation was so stressful for Lauren that her brain released a ton of stress hormones into her body. So much so that these stress hormones literally paralysed her heart. And so you can understand why all the doctors thought this was a heart attack, because this sort of looked like one. But this condition does have its own name. It's called stress cardiomyopathy. However, it's known by its more casual name, which is broken heart syndrome. Basically, Lauren loved her husband so much that to witness what happened to him and to learn about it so suddenly and abruptly, it nearly killed her. And it just so happens that a few months before Lauren was checked into the hospital, Dr. Farlinger happened to read a medical article about broken heart syndrome. And the only way you can treat broken heart syndrome is just to try to keep the patient alive long enough that the stress hormones leave their body naturally, at which point their heart goes back to normal. And so Dr. Farlinger was able to buy Lauren a little bit of time right at the end there by giving her that medicine that boosted her blood pressure. But Dr. Farlinger told her 3 kids that really it was up to them to keep their mother alive. They needed to crowd around their mum and just talk to her and tell her that you love her show her that you're here with her. Give her a reason to fight and hold on. Even though she's not saying or doing anything, she's still alive and she can hear you. So talk to her. And so Lauren's kids just sat around their mother and just showered her with love and affection. And sure enough, a few days later, when Lauren did kind of come out of it and recover, she would say that she felt herself drifting off towards death. I mean, she really knew she was dying. But then she remembers hearing her kids calling to her and saying how much they loved her and to please come back. We need you. We already lost Dad. We gotta keep you. And Lauren would say that's the reason she's still here today. It's because she held on for her kids. She felt like it was her duty to be here for her family, and so that's what saved her life. Right off the bat, let me inform you that I am a content creator. I won't reveal my identity for obvious reasons, but I will say that I focus on true crime stories. My channel isn't the biggest, but it's definitely not the smallest. My most recent videos have been reaching over 1 million views on a regular basis, which feels utterly crazy to me. I'm incredibly grateful for all the love and attention, especially because I really enjoy what I do, but I'm also incredibly nervous about all of it. Admittedly, for someone who's always researching and talking about scary stuff, I get scared easily. I'm the type of person who jumps at the smallest sound, and when I get creeped out, I start looking over my shoulder and watching every shadow in the dark. Maybe it wasn't the brightest idea for someone like me to start a job where I look at things that scare the shit of me on a daily basis, but this is just the way that I've always been. And recently, I've come to the conclusion that I have good reason to be this way. It started about a year ago, when I hadn't quite reached 1 million views yet. I got this really concerning comment. This is the internet, so obviously there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of absolutely absurd comments from people ranging from trolls to spam bots to just plain immaturity. And as someone who focuses on true crime, the nature of these comments can be even worse than usual. I've gotten a lot of comments in the past about how people are living under my floors or saving a spot in their basement for me, or occasionally how I look especially submissive and breedable in this one, so it's safe to say that nothing surprises me anymore. But there was one that crossed the line over from playful to threatening. It was that dreadful sort of moment that I think everybody on the internet, especially those of us with any amount of fame, prayed would never happen to them. Someone posted a comment that revealed the address to my house. I immediately removed it after making note of the username and metadata, hoping to God that no one else saw that. It had been posted right as I was scrolling through to read the early comments, so I doubt it was seen by many people, but I know that once it's on the internet, it's there forever. I always knew that something like this was a possibility, but for it to actually happen shook me to my core. In passing, I had imagined what I might do if someone ever put my personal information out there, but I never really thought my imagination would become reality. The comment had no extra details, no extra words, nothing. It was just my address, in full, plain as day, posted on the internet for everyone to see. I don't know if that was more or less comforting than if it had had some sort of context behind it. The context that I did gather just made me feel way worse. The user who had posted it was someone under the name Your Own Personal Nightmare. They had a default icon, default banner, and no videos of their own. Their profile was over 10 years old, and it was completely blank, except for one public playlist, which was titled Sleep. In this playlist was every single video you could find on YouTube with me in it, all of my own videos, plus every podcast I'd been on, every collab I'd done, every live stream, every fan edit. If the video featured my face and my name, it was in that playlist. I know I have fans who love me, and some people fall asleep to my videos, but this was something so much more intense. I scrolled for a long time before giving up. I'm not sure what I was looking for. They all met the same criteria. The playlist had well over 2,000 videos. It was hundreds upon thousands of videos of just me. I would have posted the link to it here to see if someone could look through it for me, but it's gone now. After I deleted that comment, I contacted the police. I know the local police force probably wasn't the best choice, but I didn't know who else to call. I told them how someone had put my address online, and the woman on the other line told me there wasn't much more they could do now that I deleted it, that it was more of an internal issue with YouTube, but she would at least talk to the detective unit and see if one of them was interested in looking into it for me. By the time a detective had gotten back to me, a few days later, the whole channel was gone. I mean, completely gone. After getting the detective up to speed, I went to share the link to this person's profile with him and found that the link now went to an error page I had never seen before that just said, "This user does not exist." I even tried looking it up on the Wayback Machine, especially since their profile was well over a decade old, and it came up with nothing. When I told the detective this, he said they probably got banned and bet that I wasn't the only one whose address they were sharing around. This made perfect sense to me, but something still just felt off about the whole thing. He told me that if it makes me feel any better, he would look into it and try to find more information, but he couldn't make any promises. Typical. He gave me his extension and told me to call him in case anything happens. Several months went by and nothing happened. The profile was still gone and the detective never did find anything else. Since my channel was getting bigger, I hired a moderator's team to keep track of comments for me, and they do a really good job. But no more concerning comments have come up, unless you count shitposting and spam as concerning. I figured it was just one of those things, one of the consequences of putting yourself out there. I figured that the detective was probably right. It was probably just some punk who decided to dox a bunch of people, and then they were either banned or just decided to quit for reasons I would never know. It's not uncommon at all for people to just abandon things on the internet out of nowhere with no explanation, as eerie as it may seem. I would never know what happened, and as long as it didn't happen again, I would be okay with that. The whole thing would just fade into obscurity, and I would start to settle back into my life, finally putting it behind me, finally feeling safe and secure in my own home once more. Then, just a few weeks ago, I got a strange email. After publishing a video that I had worked very long and hard on, I spent the following day looking over emails sent to my business inbox. By this point in time, I was getting dozens of emails a day from all sorts of companies asking if I would be interested in advertising their product or service in exchange for their sponsorship. Fielding these emails is an all-day affair, so I block out one day a week to go through all of them, and by the time I'm done, I can see nothing but huge blocks of text every time I close my eyes. It's an incredibly monotonous task, wading through mountains of mail that are all pretty much the same. On that day, I was looking through that week's inbox and clicked on one email that looked just about the same as all the others. Subject line: "Can I count on your support?" Dear My Name, I'm writing you concerning a sponsorship opportunity with Yosemite Parks Network. We are excited to announce our need. Please tell me you remember me. I'm not going to talk about my wife's name. I'm going to keep her out of it, I promise. Tell me you remember me. You need new camera. I've been watching, so I know that. That was it. The email was sent from someone with the name Catherine. No last Catherine, censored for privacy, a domain which, at the time of writing this, doesn't go anywhere if I type it into my browser. I tried to reply back, basically just to tell them to fuck off, and that this email is only for serious business inquiries, but it bounced back. I'm assuming the email address itself isn't real either. I didn't know what to make of this. I wanted to brush it off, chalk it up to some troll trying to mess with me. I know that there's a way to send emails from spoofed addresses, and it wouldn't be the first time I've received some weird, creepy message from a fan, even in my business inbox. That said, this one in particular just really got under my skin. I rarely mention my wife's name in my videos, though I know I've said it a few times, and it's a pretty common name, so I could explain that away. What's weirder is that I had just been at Yosemite National Park not that long ago, and I hadn't said anything online about it yet. On top of that, the camera that I was using to film died in the middle of recording the night before I got the email. The more I thought about it, the more conflicted I felt. I could come up with a dozen ways in which all of this could just be coincidence. And on the flip side, I began thinking of all the ways someone might have found their way into my phone or computer. Anxiety is something I've always had trouble with since I was young. After struggling with it for a long while, I figured out that it's easy to spiral when you're in your head about something, especially when you spend all day filling your head with scary stories. Eventually, you have to come to accept that there isn't a clear answer to every question, and sometimes it's better for you to just leave a thought be. So, the longer I sat there, contemplating this email, the more I felt compelled to just forget about it. At the time, it never came to my mind that could be related to the violative comment I had gotten a year ago. I had no reason to connect those two events. Until now. Last night, I was in my studio working on a video. My wife had gone to bed, and I was sitting in the other room recording. I snore pretty loud, and my wife is a light sleeper. She has a stressful job she has to leave for very early in the mornings. I prefer to spend time together during the day after she gets out, and then I work at night while she gets her rest, and I don't go to bed until she leaves. I sat in the room alone as I worked on some research for another video. I had my headphones on as I was listening over an audio file. About halfway through, I started hearing this whining noise, and I realised that it wasn't coming from the audio file. I paused what I was listening to, moved one of the headphone speakers off my ear, and I sat and listened closely. I could still hear the noise just faintly. This high-pitched whining sound, sort of fading in and out, muffled as if it was coming from behind one of the walls. My anxiety started creeping the longer I sat there, unable to attribute it to anything I was familiar with. Everything felt like slow motion, and I knew as the tension continued to build within me, I would have to cut it eventually. Nervously, I pulled my headphones down and I called out, "Hello." Immediately, the noise stopped. I heard a shuffling sound coming from down the hallway, growing louder and louder, rapidly approaching my door, before stopping and scratching the wood. It was my dog. You can imagine my sigh of relief. I opened the door just slightly, and he shimmied his way inside the room. I stepped out and took a quick peek down the hall, just to be sure, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I figured the whining must have been coming from the dog sitting outside of the bedroom door, which my wife had closed before turning in for the night. But then, from behind me, I heard my dog suddenly start growling. When I turned around, he was staring at the wall where I have my computer set up, and he was growling viciously. I stood frozen in fear for a moment, and then he started barking and howling. Just outside of my recording studio, I heard the frantic rustling of leaves and what sounded like someone running through the grass, which quickly quieted until I couldn't hear it anymore. After a beat, my dog stopped barking, turned around to face me, and looked up at me with his happy, shining eyes, wagging his tail like everything was perfectly normal. I checked the security cameras on my house, but I only have one facing the front door and one facing the back door, and neither of them caught anything of interest. At this point, I was honestly scared shitless, and it was the middle of the night, so I decided to crawl into bed and scroll on my phone till the morning. There was no way I was going to sleep. I heard every little noise around me like the world was on full volume, but thankfully there was no more whining and no more rustling. I stared at my phone until my eyes blistered, and I kept checking the security cameras over and over. When the sun finally came up and I could hear the hustle and bustle of daily life coming from the neighbourhood, I decided I felt safe enough to step out and walk around to see if there was any evidence of what I had heard last night. I hoped, however fruitlessly, that I had just imagined the whole thing. I took my dog with me for extra measure. He needed to go out for his morning walk anyways. I walked around the perimeter of my house, and sure enough, the bushes just outside of my recording studio were a mess. There were scattered leaves all over the ground, and the flower bed had been stomped on. My dog ran up to the bush and started sniffing around like crazy. Then he lifted his leg and watered the smushed flowers. I stood there with him while he did his business, and I found myself just staring at the scene in front of me. Someone had been right outside of my house. Were they watching me? Waiting for me? Why? As I continued to stare down the brick wall before me, the sun shone right on it, with a passing glint of sunlight hitting just the right spot. I noticed something just barely visible, hiding beneath the bush line. This was where everything all came together. Written in yellow chalk against white brick were the words, "Tell me you remember me, your own personal nightmare." My first memory of sleep paralysis happened when I was 10 years old. I remember because it was the night my parents took me to see Shrek 2 for getting good marks on my report card. It was an evening show, so we got in late, and my mum tucked me straight into bed when we got home. It was around 4 a.m. when I woke up. The light from my alarm clock told me that much. I couldn't feel anything, not my pyjamas against my skin, or the warmth of my head against the pillow. I could feel my arms and legs, but they felt heavy, as if a great weight was holding them down. I tried to call out, but I couldn't. My voice caught in my throat, my lips unable to move. I mustered a weak groan that sounded like a cross between a frog's croak and a zombie's moan, but that was it. I thought I was dead, that this is what death feels like, being awake but unable to move or tell anyone. My mind wrestled with the idea of being placed in a coffin, unable to tell anyone I was still alive in here, unable to move or say anything as the lid closed and they put me in the ground, still alive. My fear subsided as I felt my heart thudding in my chest in response to my near panic attack. I also became aware of my breathing, which slowed as the fear subsided. I calmed a little, thinking it was just a dream. That was when I saw him for the first time. Mr. Brownstick Legs. He huddled in the corner of the room by my closet. His 2 oversized red eyes glowed in the dark of my bedroom. His face was like a porcelain mask, white, expressionless, with no mouth or nose, only those 2 haunting red eyes. When he stood up, his body unfolded like origami until his head reached the ceiling. His neck bent, tilting forward as his true height was greater than the height of my room. His long black torso was covered in shimmering symbols that reflected red in the light of his glowing eyes. He stood on 2 spindly, thin legs that disappeared into the shadows of the room. He made no noise as he moved, seeming to glide as he hovered closer to my bed. His long, thin arms reached down to me as I moaned through paralyzed lips. I could not scream. even though I very much wanted to. His fingers reaching through the darkness down to my face. 2 pointed fingers touched against my eyelids, pushing them closed. I remember his fingertips feeling cool, but not cold. Even though the ends of his fingertips looked sharp, his touch was gentle. "Do not struggle, little one. Sleep, sleep," he said. His voice was so deep I could feel it in my chest when he spoke. I did as instructed, convincing myself that it indeed was a dream. Even if it wasn't, the back of my eyelids was more reassuring than looking into those piercing red eyes in his vacant mask of a face. I closed my eyes, wanting it to be a dream, willing it to be a dream. I woke up the next morning, thankfully able to move, walk and talk. I explained what I saw to my parents, who both agreed that it was a dream. My mum tried floating the idea that something from Shrek 2 scared me, but neither my dad or I bought it. For confirmation, Dad asked that I draw a picture of what I saw for them. As I was drawing, I ran out of black crayon and had to finish his legs with the next darkest colour in my crayon box. "Hey there, Mr. Brownstick Legs," my dad said as I handed him the drawing. "You leave my daughter alone now, you hear?" This is how my sleep paralysis demon ended up with the name Mr. Brownstick Legs. Giving him a silly name helped take some of the edge off of going to bed the following night. My dad even did a sweep of the room, calling out for him. "Here, Mr. Brownstick Legs," he said, whistling as if he were calling a dog. It made me giggle, and the whole episode felt more fun than scary. But once they tucked me in and turned off the light, I felt the dread creeping back in. Darkness hits harder when you expect to find something lurking in the shadows. I don't know how long I searched, but I eventually fell asleep. In the weeks following, I searched for Mr. Brownstick Legs every night as I fell asleep. Even when I went to sleepovers, I would do a cursory check in case he tagged along to a friend's house. As time passed, my searches became less frequent. It was a couple months later, the night before my first day of 5th grade, when I woke up to Mr. Brownstick Legs straddled over my bed, his empty plate of a face inches from my own. A scream stuck in my throat, coming out sounding like a gush of air releasing from a pool float. "Hush, child," he said. His voice was deep, echoless. I didn't know how he spoke without a mouth, but I heard him nonetheless. I saw that he held a piece of paper in his thin fingers, crumpled on the edges and torn. He held it up to show me. On the page was a pink blob with blue dots for eyes, and a droll red smile and stick lines for legs and arms. It was lying on a blue rectangle. "I found the picture you drew of me, so I drew a picture of you," he said. "Do you like it?" I tried nodding, but I couldn't move. I tried answering, but all that came out was the same dry, croaking sound. "Will you draw another one for me? I so liked the first one. You gave me pants. I look good in pants." Again, I was unable to respond or move to give him an answer. He must have been able to read my intent because he tucked the picture under my pillow before closing my eyes again. When I woke up in the morning, I bolted upright and tossed my pillow off the bed. My heart leapt into my throat when I found the picture. It wasn't a dream. He was real. I went to my desk and began drawing a picture for him, starting with his face and eyes, trying to capture as much detail as I could remember. I had forgotten all about the first day of school until my mum opened my door and found me still in my pyjamas. "Lexi," she yelled, startling me as I was colouring in his eyes. "Your bus will be here in less than an hour. Get dressed now." I tucked my picture into my school backpack and got dressed. I finished my drawing at recess that day, using my brand new Crayola 64 pack that I got with my back-to-school supplies. I gave him blue pants this time, figuring he'd like to see himself in jeans. I wrote his name, Mr. Brown Sticklegs, at the bottom of the picture and drew a smiley face next to it, hoping he'd like his nickname. I flipped the paper over to write him a message on the back. I wanted to ask him questions, but didn't want to anger him since he visited me when I was at my most vulnerable. I wrote out my letter on a separate piece of paper before copying it over to the back of my picture. Dear Mr. Brown Sticklegs, that's your name. My name is Lexi. I am in the 5th grade. What is your name? How old are you? Do you go to school? Why do you visit my bedroom? Why can't I move when you visit? You look scary, but you also seem nice. I hope we can be friends. Love, Lexi. P.S. I hope you like your blue pants. I added another smiley face at the end of the letter, my final emphasis on wanting to be friends. I considered closing with sincerely, but I figured love was a better, friendlier choice. I tucked the picture under my pillow that night, now anxious to see him rather than filled with dread of his reappearance. But, like the last time, he did not return the next day, or the day after. The days stretched into weeks, and every morning I found the picture tucked under my pillow from the night before. It wasn't until Thanksgiving break that I saw him again. My eyes opened as the morning sun poked through the blinds of my bedroom. His body didn't look any different in the light. In fact, his black skin seemed darker, absorbing the sun's rays without giving anything back. His eyes seemed wider than before. If he had a mouth, I would have figured he was smiling. In his slender fingers was the picture I drew for him. Hello, Lexi, he said. Thank you for the picture. I do look good in blue pants. I wanted to smile, but, well, sleep paralysis. He flipped the picture over to the side with my letter. I will answer your questions the best I can. I do not have a name, not one you could ever pronounce, but I am happy for you to call me Mr. Brown Sticklegs. As for my age, I exist outside of the construct of time, therefore I am ageless. I do not go to school, nor do I know what school is. Why do I visit you? I visit to feed on the energy of your soul. My breath quickened as a mute groan exited my teeth. I wanted to run, wanted to get away from him, but I was pinned down, unable to move. He sensed my uneasiness and tried to calm me by patting my forehead. Let me explain. Have you been to the ocean? It appears vast, almost limitless, as you stare out into the blue water, with no visible land on the other side. In my mind, I was standing on a beach. I felt the salty ocean breeze against my face as I looked out over the massive body of water. The waves crashed at my feet. I felt the rush of water over them, followed by the trickle of sand and pebbles as the water drew back. Your soul is like an ocean, child, vast, limitless, undefinable by words to your understanding. I take only a tiny sip, a single glass of water from a vast ocean. I am not one who could consume an entire ocean. Dark clouds formed over the water as I stared at the white-capped waves. The clouds unleashed a heavy downpour, turning the horizon grey as rain fell from the sky over the ocean. Just as the rain falls over the ocean, your soul can replenish itself by more than I could ever consume, not even in 1,000 of your years. Does that make you feel better? On the beach in my mind's vision, I nodded. In my bedroom, he nodded back at me. Good. As for your last question, why you cannot move, we are meeting at a point outside of your time, where your world and mine touch. Your physical body cannot move here, but if you persist, you can learn to speak to me with your mind, and I will answer your questions in exchange for your drawings. You can draw pictures of whatever you like. I want to know more of your world. In my mind, I nodded again. This knowledge is a gift, so we can understand one another more. I am not one who once again, closing them. In my mind's eye, I was still on the beach, but the sun was setting and no stars were visible through the rain. I drifted back to sleep to the sound of falling rain. The next morning, I asked my parents for a sketchbook and coloured pencils. They tried to hold me off until Christmas, but since I spent most of my afternoons and weekends drawing pictures up in my room, Dad let me open one of my gifts a week early. A Strathmore sketchbook with 100 pages with a 50-pack of Crayola coloured pencils. I started by drawing the rest of my family, Mum, Dad, my little brother, Tommy, our cat Libby, and even though he had died, our dog Pancakes. Next I drew our house, then our car, then my school. I kept drawing anything I could think of, trees, birds, insects, until my sketchbook was full. I used my allowance to purchase more books so I could keep drawing. I honed my craft, redoing my earlier drawings in greater detail. My thoughts considered his wording. I am not one who could consume an entire ocean. I wanted to ask him if there were those who could, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to know such things. Mr. Brownstick Legs didn't return until my freshman year of high school. To him, it wasn't like any time had passed. I read up on lucid dreaming in the time between visits, so that when he returned, I would be better capable of talking to him. He held my book in his hands, flipping through my drawings, doting over the increased refinement of my drawing skills. I had filled a dozen sketch pads and upgraded from Crayola to Prismacolor Premier pencils for my drawings. His biggest surprise was when, after he complimented my drawings, I spoke to him. "Thank you," I said, seeing the words in my mind as I spoke them aloud. If he had a surprised expression, his eyes showed it. "You have been very busy, child," he said. "Do you have any questions you would like to ask?" I hesitated, but finally formed the words in my mind. "Are there creatures who can consume an entire ocean?" He didn't respond right away, which made me think I had not asked properly. As I asked him a second time, he put a finger to my lips as if to shush me. "There are those who can. They are known as the Dark Ones. They are capable of consuming entire souls, emptying them out, leaving them dry and barren. You should not fear them, but you should also not provoke them." His eyes curved downward, as if concerned or afraid. "What do they look like?" I asked. In my mind, my visions were filled with images of great terrible creatures, spiders taller than the Empire State Building on thin, spindly legs of shadow and smoke, tentacled monsters in the seas, lofting blue whales like they were toys, ripping them to shreds with their curved chitinous beaks, great, ghastly flying creatures that knocked over orchards and forests with the beat of their leathery wings. "I showed you only because you ask," Mr. Brownstick Legs said, "but it is best that we don't talk or think about them. Let them be." I nodded in my mind. He leaned forward and pressed his plate-like face to my head as if to kiss me on the forehead, which was odd since he didn't have a mouth. Then, as usual, he closed my eyes and I drifted back to sleep. My life took a downturn during the latter years of high school. My dad lost his job, and when the search for a new one dragged on, he turned to drinking to cope with his failure. He wasn't abusive, but he wasn't fun to be around either. In the months following, my parents would hush their arguing when I entered the room, greeting me with smiles as if nothing were wrong. That lasted until the day I came home from school, to them fighting over a foreclosure notice from the bank. We moved out over a weekend from our home in the suburbs to an apartment on the other side of town. I internalized my feelings during that time. I withdrew from my friends and school activities, besides the art club, the only one we could still afford. I saw my friends driving to school and hanging out while I rode the bus, too poor and too far out of the way to join in. My taste began to change as well. Out was the bubblegum pop of Katy Perry, Kid Olaha, and Taylor Swift. Instead, I listened to Pierce the Veil, Sleeping with Sirens, and Bring Me the Horizon. My clothes and makeup became darker, more black t-shirts and skirts with black eyeliner and black fingernail polish. Mum called it my goth phase, not that she understood. My drawings became darker too. I moved from coloured pencils to charcoal, drawing skulls and gothic-looking cemeteries as my passion for drawing animals and flowers waned. I also drew the dark ones in great detail, exactly how I remembered them in my mind's eye. Mr. Brownstick Legs visited me again a month after we moved into the apartment. He looked more at home in my room of black light posters and death metal bands than he did in my previous room. His eyes were dim, not the vibrant red as they were before. He stared at me as I lay in bed, unable to move. He moved inches from my face as I heard his words in my mind. Your soul tastes different now. He didn't speak of my drawings. I worried that he might, especially since I had been drawing the dark ones. Not only drawing them, but thinking about them, and what type of damage they could do if they were to wake. He seemed sad for me, although reading his expression was difficult with no face. He patted my forehead like before, but didn't close my eyes before leaving as he used to. My life continued its spiralling path, like a bottle rocket with a broken stick. My parents didn't talk outside of short conversations about which bills to pay and which ones to ignore. Each night, Dad disappeared into a bottle, while Mum disappeared online to chat with a male Facebook friend she knew from high school. The thing about rock bottom is that it's often a disguise for a trapdoor that drops you to an even lower depth than you thought possible. The first bottom came when my father died, drove off the road into a gravel pit late at night with an empty bottle of bourbon in the passenger seat. I cried, but it felt hollow. I felt hollow. Even when Mum tried to hold me, I felt nothing inside. Not sadness, not guilt, not anything. I disappeared into my sketchbooks, drawing even darker, more disturbing images. Death, dismemberment, vividly accurate vivisections of the cute animals I used to enjoy drawing. My friends no longer talked to me, which was fine because I didn't want to talk to them anymore anyways. I found people to hang out with, not friends, but people who could get me access to moments of chemical-induced euphoria to forget about life for a while. Just like that, the trapdoor opened, dropping me to a new rock bottom of addiction. One thing I had that in common with my dad, but instead of falling into a bottle, I fell into a needle. I stole money from my mum's purse to feed my habits, not that she noticed. She was busy with her old Facebook friend who had moved from online acquaintance to nightly sleepover companion. When the time came to begin my senior year, I didn't bother going back. I kept drawing, filling entire sketchbooks with the dark images that reflected my bleak outlook on life. The dark ones were prevalent subjects during this period of my life. I drew them feasting on humanity, raking flesh from bone in their jagged teeth behind lips of smoke. I came home one night to find my mum and her new male friend in the middle of a fight. It was different from her fights with Dad, more violent, more physical. When he raised his hand at me for trying to intervene, I decided it was time to bolt. I left home, hitching rides with anyone with a set of wheels I could manage to put up with for short periods of time. My preference leaned towards those with access to the chemical release I craved. The more I could numb, the more I could escape. I found certain drug combinations had similar effects to sleep paralysis, where my mind's ability to control my body's action became severed. In those moments of numbed paralysis, I'd see Mr. Brownstick legs watching from afar as I dulled the pain. I saw what I perceived as the Dark Ones too, but they weren't hiding in the shadows like Mr. Brownstick legs did. They were the shadows. I called out to them as well, for in those moments I wanted nothing more than to be hollowed out and empty, a void so dark no pain could ever penetrate it. When they didn't answer, I called out to Mr. Brownstick legs, but he would vanish every time. Perhaps it was all just a drug-fueled hallucination. Overdosing was never my intention. I was pushing too much, trying to find the edge of the void after feeling so low, so very low, searching for that something extra to filter out the background noise. I took it too far, giving myself a near lethal dose. At one moment, I was lying next to strangers on a stained mattress in an abandoned warehouse. Then came the initial rush of euphoric bliss, and then nothing. Whoever I was travelling with at the time dumped me on the curb in front of the ER, making me someone else's problem. This was my rock bottom moment, although at the time it felt more like freefall. I spent 3 weeks in a coma. I was aware of my surroundings and could hear the doctors and nurses as they checked my vitals and tended to my cleanliness and upkeep, but I couldn't move or speak. At the end of my 3rd week in the ICU on an incubator, I looked up to find Mr. Brownstick legs hovering over me, his round red eyes peering through the darkness. "What have you done to yourself, child?" His voice spoke inside my mind. In my mind, I was beside him, standing in the middle of a vast, salt, flat desert. The ground was cracked and dry in a hexagonal pattern that stretched in all directions. "This is your soul now. There is nothing left to drink." I heard my beep of my heart rate monitor back in my hospital room. Speed up as fear entered my mind. "I called out to the Dark Ones," I said. "I asked for them to come. They emptied me out, emptied my soul." "No, my child, you did this. You have not replenished. You have only consumed. And now, nothing remains." I dropped to my knees in the middle of the salt as I felt a rumbling deep inside the hollow pit of my stomach. I leaned forward onto my arms, but they were no longer my arms. They were pitch black and empty. I could feel them, but when I looked at them, they were empty voids of smoke and shadow. I stood up on my legs, but they were no longer my legs. The darkness swirled up my torso and down my arms. The emptiness inside me consumed my entire body until only my head remained. "What's happening to me?" I heard a snap as my arms and legs split, forming 8 black, spindly, thin legs. I collapsed onto them, unable to support myself. Mr. Brownstick legs glided down in front of my face, his eyes inches from my own. "As I told you, child, only the Dark Ones have the ability to consume an entire ocean of a soul. That is your fate. That is what you will become." Back in the room, my heart rate monitor crashed to a flat line. I felt the cold darkness swirl up my neck to my head as the void consumed me. I was aware of the nurses and doctors huddled around my body, prepping the crash cart, but all I felt was the cold, consuming what was left of me. "Help me," I uttered. "Please." My physical body jolted from the electric paddles, but I felt nothing, only the cold darkness. A needle injected into my IV line as they recharged for another burst of electricity. Still, I felt nothing, only cold, only darkness, only the vast emptiness of the void. Mr. Brownstick legs tilted his head as he stared through his unblinking red eyes. He leaned forward, pressing his plate-like face to my forehead. I felt a vibration against my skin, followed by the tingling sensation darkness receded back down my arms and legs. As he pulled back, the red in his eyes had diminished. A gift for the girl who gave me pants. A tear formed in my eye. It rolled down my cheek and fell onto the parched landscape below. Before I could say anything, an electronic jolt coursed through my body, pulling me away from the salt-flat expanse and back to my hospital room. The sinus rhythm of my heart rate monitor returned to normal. I felt the cool gel of the defibrillator paddles against my chest. I remember squeezing the hand of one of the attending nurses, who smiled down at me. "Look who's awake," I cried, but it was different than before. I felt the pain I had long been avoiding, but I felt something else as well. I felt grateful, and I felt a sense of hope I hadn't known in a long time. It was a long road back from the darkness, but the thing about the road to recovery is that, like a road, it leads to a destination. After years of listless drifting towards the void, having a destination was an important first step in finding self-love. I reconnected with my mother, who was struggling with her own form of the darkness. We leaned on one another, talking and going to therapy as we worked through the issues that drove us apart. After my release from the hospital, I moved back home with her Facebook friend long gone. I got my GED and used my many sketchbooks as a portfolio to get an apprenticeship at a tattoo parlour. I've been clean for 4 years now, and it feels good to smile again. Granted, I still prefer Pierce the Veil to anything from Katy Perry's catalogue, and my tattoos and jewellery have more skulls than fluffy bunnies, but that's all on the surface. I no longer crave the darkness to consume me. I often think about the vision with Mr. Brownstick legs on the salt flats that night in the hospital. I had not seen him since that night, and I often wonder about the state of my soul since that day. Has it replenished, or is it still the dried-up barren wasteland that he took me to on the night? Last night, around 3 in the morning, I finally got my answer. I woke up with a heaviness on my chest, arms and legs. At first I felt the grips of fear grabbing hold, much like the first time I experienced it. But then, in the dark corner of my room, I saw glowing red eyes staring back at me from the shadows. In spite of my sleep paralysis, couldn't help but smile when I heard his voice call out to me.